Welcome to the workshop on artificial consciousness, 3 fighting perspectives. The 3 contenders are Antonio Chella standing for I and robotics, Pietro Perconti standing for cognition, and Riccardo Manzotti standing for ontological revision. The rules of engagement of the competition are the following. After a short introduction, each contender will present his position in 20 minutes. Then, a 1-hour panel will follow, led by Tim Parks, the renowned English novelist and scientific disseminator. Finally, the audience can vote for the most convincing position. Is artificial consciousness possible? Yes, according to Antonio Chella, there is no mystery in consciousness. All the signs of consciousness, like attention, planning, interaction, self-recognition, self-monitoring, and so on, can be implemented and integrated into a robot architecture.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Antonio Chella from the University of Palermo, Department of Engineering. I am the head of the Robotics Lab. My works concerns robot consciousness, machine consciousness, and more in general, AI and robotic systems. And I am the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Artificial Intelligence and Consciousness, previously known as the International Journal of Machine Consciousness. I edited books related to machine consciousness. I organized workshops, tutorials, and so on. I am a professor in robotics. And in this workshop, my position is quite clear. I do believe that artificial consciousness is possible because there is no mystery in consciousness. All the signs of consciousness, all that we consider as signs of consciousness, as the capability of paying attention, the capability of planning, the capability of interacting with people, even the capability of self-recognition or self-monitoring, can be suitably implemented by a computational model and can be suitably integrated in a robot architecture. So there is no mystery in consciousness. Consciousness is an engineering problem. There are many huge, difficult problems of implementing all these signs of consciousness and integrating in a computational architecture, in a robot. But there is no mystery, there is no magic. It is possible to have a conscious robot. So I will ask for your vote. Thank you so much.
Is artificial consciousness possible? No, according to Riccardo Manzotti, consciousness does not emerge from the information computations inside a brain or inside an eye system. Consciousness is the external world itself. A revision of our ontology is needed.
Hi, my name is Riccardo Manzotti. By background, I'm an engineer and a computer scientist, and I also have a PhD in robotics. But I'm also a philosopher, a theoretical philosopher and a philosopher of mind. I've also been working for 10 years as a psychologist. My main interest has always been the nature of consciousness and what is consciousness in the physical world. And after spending many years as an engineer trying to find out how computation may create something like our conscious experience, I got to the conclusion that we need a deep revision of our understanding of reality, of the physical world. I've been a Fulbright visiting professor at the philosophy department at MIT in Boston. I wrote many papers on the topic of consciousness, both on AI journals and philosophy journals. And I published several books on these topics, among which I like to remember The Spread Mind, published in New York by OR Books, where I outline my key hypothesis about consciousness. And I hold a column on the New York Review of Books about consciousness together with Tim Parks. Just now, OR Books has also published a new book called Dialogues on Consciousness, where Tim Parks and I try to address the puzzle of consciousness from a new and original perspective. I am a physicalist, and I believe that if consciousness is real, it has to be physical.
Is artificial consciousness possible? Maybe according to Pietro Perconti, right computations suffice for having the artificial consciousness, but unfortunately, we have them not yet, and they will not emerge spontaneously. We have to put in the right features from the very beginning of the computational design. This is possible, but it is not yet happening.
Hi everyone, my name is Pietro Perconti, and I am Professor of Philosophy of Mind at the University of Messina in Sicily, in Italy. In this university, I am currently the director of the Department of Cognitive Science, and my main research fields include social cognition, consciousness, and the social role of cognitive science. In the past, my research fields also cover history of Western philosophy, in particular German classical age. I am the author of over 100 publications, including 8 books in some languages, in particular Italian, English, French, and German. My attempt here is in this three-fighting perspective on artificial consciousness. My attempt here is to argue for the maybe account. After the alternatives by my colleagues Riccardo Manzotti and Antonio Chella, which are for the yes and no alternatives, I would like to defend the maybe account. And the maybe account can be summarized as follows. A right computation suffices for having artificial consciousness, but unfortunately we have them not yet, and they will not emerge spontaneously. We have to put in the right features from the very beginning of the computational design. And this is possible, but unfortunately it is not yet happening. Make the right choice and vote for the maybe account.
At the end of the workshop, we will provide you with a link to a survey where you can vote. Your vote is anonymous, and the results of the survey will be freely available. Now, let's start.
So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Antonio Chella from the University of Palermo and ICAR CNR in Palermo, and I would try to convince you to vote for machine consciousness. I try to convince that the idea of a conscious robot is not so strange as it might be. And who am I? I am a computer scientist. I am at the Department of Engineering of the University of Palermo. I am the head of the robotics lab. Here you might find my email and my address. So if you are interested in my research, please feel free to contact me. I will present some joint work with some of my colleagues, in particular Arianna Pipitone, Francesco Lanza, Valeria Sedita, and of course the Pepper Robot. And my laboratory is the Robotics Lab. I founded the Robotics Lab in 1997 in Palermo. Palermo is the capital of Sicily, which is an island at the center of Sicily, at the center of the Mediterranean Sea. And here you may find some of the photos, old and new photos of some robots and some people in my laboratory. Some of my sponsors, the University of Palermo, the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, and some other sponsors. I remember that in 2007, so well before the iPhone, I found this picture I find this advertisement in a tube station in London, and I took a picture, image a phone that's image conscious. It was interesting because well before the iPhone, there was the idea by Samsung that a phone, a computer, can be conscious. So robot consciousness is not only a philosophical research topic, but it may be of interest even for firms, even for factories like Samsung. Okay, let's consider very briefly some historical moments of machine consciousness. The first appearance of the word machine consciousness, artificial consciousness, was in this book, Cybernetic Machines. This book has been published in Budapest in 1962, and it has been translated in English in 1970. Curiously, if you consider the subject index of that book, there was the word artificial consciousness, but there was no mention of artificial intelligence. So in 1962, the item artificial consciousness was already present and not the item artificial intelligence. The modern view of machine consciousness has been established by many people, essentially by Igor Alexander. That I remember that in Brighton at the ICANN conference in 1992 he presented this strange paper on capturing consciousness in neural system, and it was a modern view of robot consciousness. I remember that I attended that meeting, that conference, and I remember that at the end of his talk, Igor Alexander clearly stated that the hunting season of machine consciousness is open. I remember that I felt very impressed by this new field of machine consciousness that I never heard before. Igor Alexander summarized his word in many books, in many papers, and I want to consider this book, which is Impossible Minds, My Neuron, My Consciousness, which is the best book, in my opinion, where Igor, which is the founding father of machine consciousness, summarized his view on machine consciousness. Another milestone in the history of machine consciousness was in 2001 at the Cold Spring Harbor meeting on Can Machine Be Conscious, where Christoph Koch, at the end of the meeting, stated in his final report, which is present in the internet, that we know of no fundamental law or principle operating in this universe that forbids the existence of subjective feelings in artifacts designed or evolved by humans. So there is nothing that forbids us to build a machine conscious, to build a conscious machine. I just want to remind that together with Riccardo Manzotti, in 2007, we published this book, which is considered still today the state of the art in machine consciousness, and at least until 2007. But it is considered a reference point, a reference book in the story of machine consciousness. Very briefly, I would like to mention that in 2017, Ezra International, it is one of the places where AI started. In 2017, organized a long series of workshops on technology and consciousness, 8 weeks of workshop on technologies and consciousness. You may the final report of this workshop is freely available over the internet. Finally, let me mention this new journal, the Journal of Artificial Intelligence and Consciousness, that started the publication this year. I am the editor-in-chief, together with David Gamez and Riccardo Manzotti as executive editors. And I would like to mention the fact that papers are open access until 2020. So for the whole year, all the papers are open access. Okay. My idea is that there is no mystery in consciousness. So if you consider the typical sign of consciousness that you consider for a person, for example, the capability of attention, of paying attention, the capabilities of interact with people, the capability of generate expectation, of planning action, the capability of having some sort of inner life, so for example, inner speech and inner images, or the capability of self-recognition, or whatever else. So you may consider a list of signs of consciousness that you normally consider a person conscious should have. all these items can be easily or not so easily implemented in a machine. So there is no mystery in machine consciousness. There is no mystery in consciousness. We are capable of implementing, in a more of good way, but we are capable of implement all these elements, and so to make a machine which may be conscious in the sense that from our point of view, from the outside point of view, we might consider conscious. We might add other items, but this is some of the initial items that anyone could agree on. So the attention, the interaction capabilities, and so on. So we are able to implement all these entities, all these behaviors in a robot. So there is no mystery. There is no mystery at all. There is no strange entities like qualia or whatever else. There are no magic. There is no panpsychism or whatever. We are able to implement a machine that presents signs of consciousness, in the sense that we may implement a robot that pay attention, that robot that is able to interact, a robot is able to generate expectation, and so on and so forth. Now, I would like to show you some example that we build in my laboratory of some of these signs of consciousness. Let's start with human-robot interaction. This is a very simple form of human-robot interaction, wherever it is interesting. Hi, Pepper.
English today.
Hi. What's your name?
You can call me Pepper.
Are you conscious? Are you conscious?
I'm autonomous, but I still have to follow the laws of my programming.
Do you feel emotions? Do you feel emotions? Are you human?
Not the same way as you are, but yes I am.
Are you sentient?
Of course not, but that shouldn't keep us from chatting.
Can you see me?
I do, and I love what I see.
Can you understand me? Can you understand me?
Of course not. I'm here to help humans.
Can you remember me? Can you remember me?
I'm sorry, I don't know how to help yet. Next time, maybe.
Are you a robot? Are you a robot?
Ask me to do simple moves. I can't move exactly like you humans do.
What is a humanoid robot?
I don't understand what you're asking. I probably don't know that movement yet.
Will robots replace humans?
Ask me to do simple moves. I can't move exactly like you humans do.
How old are you?
I'm 6. I'm still pretty young.
Can you move your head?
Yes, you can tell me to open my hands or lift my arm, for example.
Can you turn your head?
Ask me to do simple moves. I can't move exactly like you humans do.
Can you look at me?
I don't understand what you're asking. I probably don't know that movement yet.
Do you see me?
Ask me to do simple moves. I can't move exactly like you humans do.
Raise your arms.
I don't understand what you're asking. I probably don't know that movement yet.
Can you look elsewhere?
Ask me to do simple moves. I can't move exactly like you humans do.
Why is your name Pepper?
My name is Pepper.
Why is your name Pepper? Who decided to call you like that?
I was created at Sofit Robotics in Paris.
Who decided to call you Pepper?
My makers decided to call me Pepper.
Why?
His name comes from the Chinese word Nanling Brain and the English word now.
Those are very simple forms of interaction, because it is essentially Pepper is a question answering system. But you can make complex as you want this kind of interaction. You should consider more complex interaction, more complex action, more complex turn taking, and so on and so forth. But this is the basic version of human robot interaction. But you can see that the robot is able to have some sort of attention, is able to follow myself, for example, or to move the hands, and so on and so forth. So in some sense it is a basic form of interaction. You make this kind of interaction as complex as you want, of course. Let's consider other example. Generation of expectation, which is one of the typical consideration in consciousness. Let's consider this experiment that we made many years ago at the Archaeological Museum in Agrigento. The robot, it was a very old robot, it was in 2004-2005, was able to perform guided tour in that museum. The robot has a kind of inner world where the museum is reproduced in 3D. You can see in the left, in the right part, and in the low part of the right of the figure, you can see the inner world of the robot, while in the upper part you can see the outer world, so the world acquired by the camera. When the robot moved, the robot was able to update his inner world, and it was able to control the synchronization, so the alignment between the external world and the inner world. So the inner world was controlled by the camera, the external world was controlled by the camera in black and white, and while the inner world is in color, and it is the inner world of the robot itself. So in this experiment, the world was a kind of alignment between the inner world and the outer world. So there is no mystery, there is no homunculus or whatever. There are some software routines that allows the robot to have an inner environment. And you may consider this one as a sort of inner images, and the external images acquired from the camera. So you have the inner images, which is a sign of inner life of the robot, and the external images. So having this kind of inner world, the robot is able also to, for example, to generate plans, to dream, and so on and so forth. So to move in the museum, in the inner world, in its inner world, without really moving. And there is no mystery. There is no strange thing as qualia. There are this is a very simple example of inner life of a robot, but without considering any strange or magic terms like qualia and so on. Inner speech, another important capability of people is inner speech, and it is considered a sign of consciousness, the capability of speech to itself. We implemented a computational model of inner speech, so the robot is able to reason by talking to itself about the current course of action. Let's consider, for example, this simple experiment where there is a robot and a user. Both the robot and the user have to set up a table by taking into account forks, spoons, plates, and so on.
Where is the napkin? The object is in the basket. did not pick it before. I can pick it now. I will use my right arm. I'm using my right arm to pick the object.
So this is a very simple experiment.
Here the napkin you asked for.
Thank you, Papa.
This is a very simple experiment. The robot reasoned what to do, considering the command that he received, pick the napkin. So there is a kind of reasoning based on inner speech. Obviously, inner speech could be more complex than that. There could be some conflicts, for example, some ethical conflicts, some moral conflict, but the basic idea is in the experiment. Finally, let us consider the self-recognition capability of the robot. The typical problem of recognition of the robot in the mirror. In this case, there is the robot. The robot wears a mask. The robot sees itself with a mask.
I think I'm the robot, and I know I'm the robot. I'm seeing a robot with a mask in the mirror. Is this robot like me? Yes, we are the same kind of robot. The robot I'm seeing is a pepper like me. The pepper robot I'm seeing in the mirror has a mask. Have I a mask? I want to touch my mouth for searching for the mask. I will use my right arm. I will try to move it. The right arm group is working. I have to move the right arm to the position of my mouth. I'm moving my arm.
So in this case, the robot tries to recognize itself by moving the arm and touch itself. I see my arm in front of the mask in the mirror. So the robot thinks that it may be itself in the mirror.
So, people think I'm a robot, and I know I'm a robot with a mask. As the robot I'm seeing in the mirror. This robot is me.
So the robot might check if there are other robots close to the robot, close to it, that wear a mask. So the robot checks if there are other robots close to it. There are no other robots, so the robot might conclude that it is itself in the mirror. So this is a typical example of self-recognition and inner speech. So the robot speaks to itself in order to recognize itself in the mirror, which is a typical sign of self-consciousness. Okay, so in this very brief talk, I would like to let you with this take-home message. There is nothing mysterious in consciousness. We may consider a list of signs of consciousness, which is considered in the typical list of signs of consciousness, and every aspect of consciousness can be easily or not so easily implemented in a robot and integrated in a robot architecture. So there is no mystery, there is no magical effect, there are no qualia, there are no psychism or whatever. There is only science, there is only physics, there is only computer science. We may implement in a robot any kind of sign of consciousness in a robot. So thank you for your conscious attention. Again, this is my card, so please feel free to contact me if you are interested in my work. Thank you for your conscious attention again.
My name is Riccardo Manzotti. I'm an Italian philosopher. My background is in robotics, AI, and artificial vision. Because of that, I've been working a lot on the relation between artificial intelligence and the problem of consciousness. And today, here, I take part to a workshop where I will challenge two of my colleagues about the possible foundations of artificial consciousness. In particular, I will challenge their view that consciousness is the outcome either of computational or cognitive processes. And I will claim that artificial consciousness or biological consciousness is something that requires the external world for many reasons that I will shortly explain. And I will defend this view in a way that is purely physicalist. So I won't need to add any new hypothesis about the existence or nature of phenomenal experience. In the past, there had been many people who, in particular in the world of artificial intelligence, who believe that consciousness is a kind of glorified information processing. They assume that somehow information becomes meaningful, or that information becomes somehow coated with a layer of phenomenal experience. This is an idea that is consistent with an approach that we may very broadly call an internalist approach, namely the idea that whatever consciousness is has to be something taking place inside the body, in particular inside the central processing unit of the body. The idea that consciousness is some kind of internal modeling or internal juice that is characterized with phenomenal character. What is phenomenal character? The notion of phenomenal character is strongly related with the notion of qualia, or with the notion of experience, or with the notion of quality. It is the idea that the world is made only of objective, quantitative properties, but that somehow, at a certain point, either in evolution or out of some magic wand in the brain, such purely quantitative activity becomes coated with the quality of our experience, which is usually called qualia. So it is as though all of a sudden the information becomes colored and filled with meaning. Unfortunately, we have no reason to think that that's the case. The main one is that we are not even sure that information exists. Let me be clear about that. Have you ever seen a bit? Have you ever seen a unit of information? I assume you haven't if you think about it. Why? Because you may see that you have seen pixels on a screen, that you have listened to sound produced by an MP3 file, or that you have just been punching cards in an old-fashioned computer or in some museum. Those are not information. Those are physical phenomena in their own right. They are LED that emit light on a screen. They are punches on a card made of paper. They are sound waves produced by a speaker driven by a computer memory, which is in turn made of resistors, transistors, and different levels of electricity and tensions and capacity. So if you look around, you don't see any bit. So why do we believe in the existence of information? Because information is a handy notion that allows us to explain in a statistical and quantitative reliable way what is done by many devices. That are the devices, no surprise, that we call computers, or cell phone, or digital network, or artificial networks. But the fact that we use information to explain what goes on in these machines doesn't require that information is something real. It is just an epistemic notion, something that is very useful to describe in a very concise way a state of things. Let me make you another example of another entity. This is just an analogy, but I think it might be quite useful. The notion of center of mass. The notion of center of mass is super easy to understand. It is the imaginary point where all the mass of an object might be taken to be, in order to simplify the calculations about its movement, trajectories, falling down, whatever. So, for example, when the center of mass of a tower is just 1 inch beyond the center of that tower, there's a high likelihood that that tower is going to collapse. But of course, there's nothing in that point. It's not that out of magic all the mass of the tower has been concentrated in the center of mass of the tower. However, from a mathematical perspective, it is very useful to make such an assumption, but it is only a mathematical trick. Likewise, consider the Earth. we feel as though we are attracted by the center of mass of the Earth. We feel as though all the mass of the Earth is concentrated at the center of our planet. But of course we know that that's not the case. And in principle, at the very center of our planet, there might be a giant cave, an empty cave, and there might be just nothing there. And we would still feel the attraction of the center of mass of the Earth as though all the mass were in the point at the center of the Earth where there would be a cave. Why is that? Because all the other particles combined of the Earth would pull us in a way that it is mathematically indistinguishable from having all the mass concentrated at the center of the Earth. Centers of mass are not real entities, they are fictionary entities, they are imaginary entities, but they are extremely useful entities. So we like to use them. The same happens with information. Information is an imaginary entity that we like to assume it is there, but no one has ever seen a bit. No one has ever seen a colored bit or a bit with meaning. We add meaning and color and whatever to the information in our computers only because such computers interact with the world in a certain way. So if you look inside a memory card, you're not going to see any meaning, any color, because everything you see is just electric level of tensions that are driven by external events in a very smart way, so that we can use such levels in order to get, when we get back from our holidays, a nice colored print or a nice colored image of our friends and families when we were by the sea. This is to say that, or just to convince you, because I imagine that I will need a lot more time to convince you that information is not a real stuff flowing or being stored inside our computers. Let me make you another example. Have you ever seen a device able to measure the amount of information inside a physical entity, like we do with weight, with mass, with electricity, with sound waves, with all other physical properties? Of course not. You cannot go to the local hardware store and buy a tool able to measure the amount of information inside a physical object, a sort of informometer. You cannot buy that. Why not? Because information is not something we measure. It's something we compute. And it is very useful, like centers of mass. But it's not a physical stuff. It's not like electricity flowing through our wires. Since information is not physical, but it is a convention to explain what we do with computers, it sounds wrong to assume that our consciousness is the product of an imaginary entity. And we have no evidence that information is going to change into anything like our conscious experience. The same rationale, in my view, holds for cognitive capabilities. Cognition is a nice way to express, to describe, to analyze what an intelligent system does when it has to cope with the environment, when it has to solve problems, when it has to find a solution, to learn, to optimize its behavior given certain parameters. Basically, that summarizes what cognition does and describes. That's a super interesting field of research, but it doesn't have anything to do with our experience. Cognition works perfectly well with systems that shows intelligent behavior, but that have no consciousness at all. I can apply all the model of cognition to systems like AI, playing chess, playing Go, playing any other kind of games. I can apply cognition to animals. I can apply cognition to higher order systems, such as a whole nation, such as the whole Chinese or American nation. Apply them to corporate companies. And I can apply cognition to all kinds of systems. Why? Because cognition is all about a way to behave. And it is a way to, it's not like traditional behaviorism, because it also considers internal states, But such internal states don't have to be conscious. There's nothing in cognitive science that requires consciousness. Cognitive science is just a way to decompose one's intelligent behavior into sub-modules that are functionally capable of carrying on a certain task in a certain way. So cognition and cognitive science, just like information, don't seem the right kind of theory or background to address the issue of consciousness. Now, in the final 7 minutes that I have, I need to convince you that my position is stronger than the one of my two friends and colleagues that have defended the relation between computations and consciousness, or between cognition and consciousness. So let me start from the basic thing that we need to explain: experience. Have you ever seen the experience? I suppose that we are conscious beings, but have you ever seen the experience of the world as something different from the world itself? Have you ever been able to, say, contrast the experience of a red apple with the red apple itself? I assume that you've never been able to do that because, in reality, you have always had a contact with the world, not with the experience of the world. I assume that you don't have a positive way to address consciousness and experience, or conscious experience, because experience is just a fancy way to refer to the fact that we assume to be different from the world. So, once we have made such an assumption, to explain that the world expresses itself in our existence, we need something else. Why? Because we have assumed that there's a world and that we are somewhere else. We need to have something from the world going into ourselves. And this something cannot be the world. The traditional idea is that experience is a way for us to have the world without being the world, to bring the world inside us without having to bring the world itself. So experience is not a positive notion, it's a negative notion. It is the idea that something has to be the world without being the world. We call it a representation of the world, a phenomenal character, a phenomenal experience of the world, which is basically the idea that the world becomes a ghost inside us. Or in the case of a machine, it becomes a ghost inside the machine. And what better than information, which is a ghost itself, as a candidate to embody such a ghostly world that we want to have in our experience, since we started from the assumption that we are separate from the world. So what I'm trying to say today is that maybe we don't need to have a magic wand inside our machines in order to have conscious machines. In order to have conscious machines, we just need a machine that behaves just like our body. And what is the trick here? The trick here is that to be conscious is not to be able to produce inside one's body or inside a machine an inner replica of the world, but rather it is a way for a machine or for a body to allow the external world to take place in a certain way. The point I want to make here is that to be conscious is not to have an inner world, to have an inner 3D representation of the world, a virtual world, to produce an internal theater, as many have believed in the past. To be conscious literally means to be the center of a world, to have a body that is the nexus of a world that is held together by that particular body. Consciousness is not an inner virtual world. Consciousness is the physical world itself, which is entangled by a body that intertwines together the events of the surrounding reality in a particular way. And consciousness is such a network. It's not something magical copy of the network inside that node, inside that key point. Consciousness is the network itself. It is the world. So, to cut a long story short and to finally summarize my proposal, I don't believe that consciousness is the information inside our brain that magically becomes colored and full of meaning. Neither do I believe that that consciousness is something related with the smart processes of a smart cognitive system. But I suggest that consciousness, both in a biological being like a mammal or a human being, or in the future in a machine, is the world of physical objects that take place because of such a body. An artificial conscious machine would not literally be a conscious machine, but would be a machine that will bring into existence a world as complex as the world that we are familiar with. The world that is one and the same with our own existence, and that it is not inside our brain or inside a device, but it is all around us. As of now, machines have not been able to do that because machines have been teleologically closed. What do I mean? I mean that the network of events that take place around a machine are strictly limited by the goals that have been selected by the designers of the machines. Even in the case of machines with AI capable of learning how to perform complex tasks, the goals of the machine remains quite limited. The automatic vehicle keeps driving and avoiding from hitting or bumping against people or other cars, but it doesn't look around to see what's going on. On the other hand, if you have a conscious human being, you will see that he will or she will immediately become enmeshed and intertwined with many events along his or her road. The idea is that an artificial machine is a machine that is able to become the nexus of a whole world that remains physically outside the machine. So there's no need to have any magic threshold, to have any emergent property out of the activities inside that machine. What it will be required, though, would be a cognitive and bodily structure and computational too. So you see, I'm not saying that it's not important to have the right tools, capable of putting together a world as that we are familiar with the same degree of complexity and with the same degree of openness, in order to allow new objects and the events to become part of such a world. So I think that we are still unable to solve the problem of an artificial conscious machine because we are looking in the wrong place, namely inside the machines. We don't need to look inside the machine, and it is not even enough to look at the body and at the sensory motor interaction, the affordances between the robots and the external world, but we need to look at the external world itself, the external world that is made possible by the existence of that machines. So we need to build machines able to make that environment richer. I think that consciousness lies exactly in that interval in which the existence of the body of a human being and in the future of an artificial conscious, quote, machine will make the environment richer. What is being conscious is to bring a world, a physical world, into existence. If you think that the world is necessary, please vote for my position. If you want to know more, you can check on my website www.riccardomanzotti.com or just contact me. I will be pleased to reply to your questions and observations. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Pietro Perconti, and this is the third fighting perspective on artificial intelligence and consciousness. The question is the same by my colleagues. Can computers become conscious or self-conscious? And after the yes and the no alternatives, this is the maybe account. According to the maybe account, the possibility of the machine consciousness depends on the way we deal with some design features. It is a matter of accepting the thesis of the computational sufficiencies by the Chalmers, stating that the right kind of computational structures sufficient for the possession of a mind, and to add some computational design constraints. To understand which are these constraints, we need to take into consideration two preliminary ideas and to ask for a key question. There are two main ways for AI systems replicating some significant aspects of consciousness. On the one hand, by simulating how this happens in humans, a kind of bio-inspired perspective, and secondly, by using deep learning techniques. While in the first, in the bio-inspired perspective, there is a naturalized concern, the second doesn't worry about the human-like nature of the cognitive architecture, which is supposed to generate the feeling of being conscious. After having produced the major advances in the perceptual fields, like vision, deep learning techniques seem ready to address high-level cognitive processes, like consciousness indeed, both in terms of accessibility and phenomenology. Joshua Bengio, with his consciousness prior hypothesis, offers a paradigmatic example of this kind of attempt. While the most usual deep learning investigations in cognitive science are focused on unconscious inference over low-level inputs, Bengio would like to extend the achievements of deep learning beyond these fields. With his words, instead of making predictions in the sensory space, one can thus make predictions in this high-level abstract space, which do not have to be limited to just the next time step, but can relate events far away from each other in time. End of quote. Bengio uses both an attention mechanism device, able to extract the relevant features from the background, and a device able to make predictions about the future. Since they are two typical cognitive processes involved in self-consciousness, Bengio realized that machine learning and deep learning networks are the best computational architectures available to model self-consciousness. On what the word self-consciousness means, I use a dual process account based on the idea that there are two different modes of brain processing, that is System 1 and System 2. While System 1 cognitive processes include mental processes that are unconscious, rapid, and automatic, System 2 includes conscious, slow, and deliberative mental processes. Following this line of reasoning, the notion of self-consciousness should be articulated in two component parts. Usually, we did not experience self-consciousness as something that comes in degrees. or that has component parts. But having experience of being self-aware is seen rather as something immediate and non-articulated. It looks like an all-or-nothing phenomenon. If one is aware of oneself, she is fully so. Otherwise, the subject is not conscious at all. The personal effect of the self-consciousness is, in a sense, similar to that of turning the light on in a room at night. If the light is on, everything is clearly visible, and if it is off, all there is in the room is plugged into darkness. Likewise, if we are aware of ourselves, all the remaining part of the mental life, moral and legal responsibility, the ability to calculate, and so on, can finally take place. But if our self-awareness vanishes, if we are dead or asleep, we are no longer responsible at all. We are no more living, and whatever happens around us is not more our concern. We therefore need to produce distinctions to better analyze the ordinary notion of self-consciousness, and to do so, we have to consider, on the one hand, all those capacities that have something to do with self-identification, and on the other, the different ways of the well-known stream of consciousness. Self-recognition is the simplest form of self-consciousness, and also the oldest from an evolutionary point of view. It requires that the subject be able to refer to himself by means of a reflective representation, a kind of meta-representation, typically a schema or an image of her own body. On the other hand, reflexive reasoning consists in the ability to consider the role that a certain concept has within the reflexive network in which it is placed. Generally speaking, reasoning means indeed being able to draw the right consequences that follow from a certain thought we entertain. It is not simply a matter of having a given idea, but of recognizing that holding it implies some kind of responsibility towards a lot of other ideas. When the conversation between two interlocutors is authentic, each of the interlocutors can appeal to the responsibility, to the discursive responsibility that the other has towards the beliefs, the concepts she assumes to be true. Usually, this kind of appeal is public because it takes place in the social practice of the conversation. However, the responsibility we have towards the network of concepts in which we wrap ourselves exercises influence also when we engage in the inner speech. In fact, inner speech is the private side of the public conversation. Well, however, after having appreciated that self-consciousness should be articulated into two component parts, that is, self-recognition, reflexive reasoning, and that it is not yet clear if computational design has to follow the traditional pathway consisting in duplicate human capabilities and human cognitive architectures, if we have to follow the more recent deep learning techniques, which are indifferent to the human-like computational design, it remains in the hand a fundamental question. What is the reason why a computer should become conscious or self-conscious? As we will see better soon, in the case of the humans, this happens essentially for social purposes, and the same maybe should happen with artificial consciousness. This is the mind reading priority account. According to the common sense view, self-consciousness is the climax of the human cognition, the top of the human cognition. And this, in fact, provides the ordinary feeling of being special, typical for human beings. But we can doubt how much nature takes care of this satisfactory feeling of being self-conscious and therefore special for humans. And what about the possibility that self-consciousness has no role, not top role in human cognition, but only a role for something else? In particular, is self-consciousness really prior to mind reading, or maybe the contrary? My preference is for the mind reading priority account, stating that mind reading evolved prior to self-consciousness, and that self-consciousness is for mind reading purposes. My idea is that self-consciousness is the logical space that social cognition needs to do its job. In other words, self-consciousness in humans is the inner space from which high-level simulation proceeds in its behavioral prediction, in theory of mind, in mind reading. High-level simulations make use of the same cognitive resources like counterfactual imagination that are in play in reflexive reasoning. When we are engaged in our inner speech, we reason in the same way as when we simulate another individual to predict her actions. In fact, in both the cases, we are linked to the discursive responsibility typical in language use. Regarding self-recognition, we have first of all taken into account the difference between body schema and body image. While to replicate body schema abilities is essentially a matter of matching some sensory motor features which are self-experienced and the correspondent observed in a given image, on the contrary, to replicate body images capabilities, we have to take into account the social skills. Body image, in fact, implies social recognition. But this raises the well-known problem of modeling social knowledge and the background knowledge with the puzzles of the frame problem typical in artificial intelligence and the difficulties of modeling the common sense knowledge. If we take into account the reflexive reasoning, we are engaged in modeling inner speech. Inner speech, indeed, consists of a temporal sequence of representations in which the attribution of a certain property to a reflexive representation has some consequence on the development of the reasoning, both in terms of inference drawn between concepts and of the experience of the new emotion. Considering reasoning in terms of inference between concepts is an idea emphasized by Bob Brandon. According to Brandon, if we want to understand what it means to have a certain mental content, we should give much less importance to the classical notion of representation, giving instead a key role to the notion of inference, instead of representation, the inference. The practice of asking for and providing justification for our ideas, for our attitudes, constantly prompt us to establish the patterns of conceptual inferences. It is just because these we are responsible for our ideas, and asked to provide reason for what we believe, we articulate inferentially our thought. If we attribute to ourselves a given property, we discover that in so doing we become responsible to our other properties, a network of properties. It is just because of the work of the language systems that, with its rules and limitations, provides a conceptual framework for reflexive thought. In having this kind of thought, what triggers the feeling of being self-conscious is the meta-representation that refers to a given reflexive representation. The sequence of such representation takes place within a story, a narrative usually produced following stereotypical blueprints. To sum up the above argument, the maybe account argues for the idea that design in artificial architecture, which is supposed to be able to produce the feeling of being a conscious creature, eventually implies the capacity to reproduce a twofold cognitive process, made up both by a recognition device and an inner speech machinery. The recognition device should include a matching process able to bring together the physical features of a robot, of an artificial body, with these of the observed image, for instance in a mirror. The inner speech machinery should be modeled on the above mentioned blueprints. On the whole, we have to reproduce a twofold cognitive process endowed with a recognition device and inner speech machinery, as said. But furthermore, we have to keep in mind that self-consciousness is for social purposes. Then we have to model common sense knowledge and social cognition. And finally, design a cognitive architecture which is compatible with the mind-reading priority account above mentioned. It is possible to have all this? Maybe, Maybe yes. Uh, uh, we have no warrant, but we can hope it. Uh, it is just matter of produce the right cognitive architectures, but the problems are real challenges, and we can only keep our fingers crossed and hope that cognitive science advances allow us to hope an artificial intelligence has the final achievement in this amazing pathway.
Okay, welcome to everybody watching this interview between Antonio Chella, Pietro Perconti, and Riccardo Manzotti. They have all three presented a report, a reflection on what they think about the possibilities of creating a machine consciousness. To summarize very rapidly, we have three very different approaches, but two of those approaches I think we could describe as internalist. That is, the world is considered as an external objective given, and consciousness generated or in some way created subjectively within a body or within a machine. Okay, inside those two positions, Antonio Chella is very, very optimistic and positive, a very practical approach. He suggests a number of ways in which we can recognize consciousness in a person or in a machine, and he suggests that these faculties can definitely, if not necessarily easily, be generated inside a machine, a robot. He actually offers us examples of a robot interacting with people, and is generally very, very positive about this. Pietro Perconti doesn't stop at the external recognition of possible consciousness within a machine, but considers the immensely complex cognitive and experiential nature of consciousness, and is thus somewhat more hesitant about the possibility of those faculties being modeled inside a machine. And finally, Riccardo Manzotti offers a position which is probably less familiar to most viewers. His position is that consciousness is not an internal process of representation and elaboration, but on the contrary, consciousness is itself the external world as the perceptual capacities of a body or of a machine allow it to manifest itself. So it doesn't occur inside the neurons or inside the electronics as Manzotti sees it, however complex they may be. But it is the world which those complex processes inside the body allow to manifest itself. And obviously, when it comes to creating a machine consciousness, this would lead to a totally different focus, I presume, on the part of anybody seeking to do that. So I suggest we start by asking Pietro Perconti and Riccardo Manzotti to question Antonio Chella about his very, very positive position. Pietro, would you like to kick off by questioning Antonio on this?
Hey, thank you. I have a good attitude towards the Antonio. His opportunistic and positive attitude. I think that as I said in the talk, the thesis of computational sufficiency is right. But I disagree about his enthusiastic attitude. Indeed, consider, for example, the part of his talk, the part of the talk of Antonio about the human-robot interaction.
Pepper.
Yeah, Pepper. Yeah. In a sense, Pepper is simply a kind of retarded people, and the interaction is nothing but ecological interaction between conscious creatures, because that kind of interaction is ruled by the concept of responsibility. And the robot has no responsibility, neither towards other people, neither towards the systems of its own conceptual network. And this suggests the feeling of being of facing toward a naive framework. Of course, I imagine the typical reaction of a roboticist. Maybe in the start, Antonio will say that that's only a toy model, and in the future all will be complicated, sophisticated. My reply is simply maybe, but we have to keep in our mind that it's not only matter of complicate things, but rather to see them in the right way from the very beginning. For example, the notion of responsibility is a key notion, and you have to put into the machine in the very beginning of the pathway. It will not emerge in a magical way once computations are enough sophisticated.
So basically, the robot doesn't feel any of the anxiety that we feel now in trying to interact in an intelligent way for our audience. Okay, and Antonio, how do you deal with that objection?
So thank you, Pietro, for the interesting question. What I showed in my video, it is as I said in the video, it is a basic version of interaction. Essentially, it's a simple question answering system. However, in my opinion, it captures many interesting facts of human-robot interaction between people. For example, the capability of pay attention to the most important things with respect to others. And even the capability of the robot of moving when I talk to the robot as a kind of gaze following, so it follows my movement, and it is able to capture the most important words in my questions. Of course, it's very simple, and in fact, I wanted to employ the basic question answering system that is already implemented in a Pepper robot. Anyway. When you have the possibility to interact with the robot, so to speak to a robot, actually I also have the impression that there is some spark of experience. It's very simple, of course, but anyway, also in this kind of interaction, you may find some aspect of this complexity that you mentioned. Of course, it is a simple reactive system, so there is no turn taking, for example. There is no model of there is no inner model of mind of the other person, as you mentioned in your video. There are very simple emotion in this. In the current version, the robot is able to take into account a very basic emotion of the opponent, and then it is able to modulate the answer considering the state of the emotional state of the other person. There are very basic elements that are present in more complex version of human-robot interaction. What is my theory is that we can list a set of ingredients that are necessary for the robot, and then we can implement to the robot. There are people that implemented very simple theory of mind, for example. There are important studies. There are any kind of things that we can think that this is an important thing for consciousness, then we can implement to a robot. The robot speak, for example, the robot talk. There is some sensation that the robot has a kind of language, as a kind of very simple form of understanding. This is a basic form. But we can go further, in my opinion.
Sorry, I think Pietro was very clear that this issue of responsibility is paramount in giving a sense of self and of involvement and commitment in a conversation rather than a simple reactive structure. So if we put responsibility first on our ingredients for consciousness, do you think that responsibility could be implemented, as you put it, in the robot?
Actually, I don't know, but I can tell that, for example, the robot could have some sort of planning, which is a typical effect of robot, to plan a trajectory. And in the same case, it is possible to plan the discourse, to plan the speech. So in order to reach some kind of goal, and even by taking into account the questions from the opponent, from the user. And I remember that many years ago I was involved in an European project named Humanops, and in this project, the goal of this project was the capability of a robot to interview people. Because interview people, as you may know, is a very interesting task, because you have a fixed plot of question, of course, but you may be ready to change your plot according to the answer. So if I say something which is completely unexpected, and then it is expected that the interviewer have to change its own plot. So it is similar to a plan. So you have a plan, you have some fixed point that you want to touch, but you should be ready to move your course of discourse according to the interaction. So it might be possible, and we had some demos in this field. The interview people is an interesting field that, according to in our project, it is possible to mechanize, to have some sort of computational model.
Okay. I'll bear that in mind as I try to conduct this interview. Riccardo, let's hear from you.
Yeah. Well, first let me say what I like very much in Antonio's approach, and generally speaking in robotics' approach to the problem to the possibility of machine consciousness, namely the lack of any biological or human chauvinism. So the idea that in principle there's no reason why we should not be able to have a machine, a conscious machine. And I totally agree, because I take consciousness to be a fact of the physical world. So there's no, as far as we know, there's no mandatory need, there's no mandatory need to have biological stuff, biological hardware. So that's something that I really agree with. But let me also say what I think is not enough in a roboticist and AI's approach. The fact that they take consciousness to be a matter of behaving as conscious humans do. So they tend to reduce the problem of consciousness to the problem of replicating the same kind of behaviors. And in many cases, my impression is that the consciousness they talk about is in the eye of the beholder. It's a little bit like the intentional stance in Dennett. Intentionality is not seen as an intrinsic property of the system, but is seen as a convenient way to describe certain agents, certain kinds of agents. And likewise, I think that it's not enough to behave like a conscious agent. So my question to Antonio is how could you distinguish between a zombie robot behaving just like a conscious being and an actual conscious being? And if, according to his view, maybe there would be no difference between the two systems. So as long as you behave as a conscious human being, you have all that you need. Or maybe if you need something else. My guess is that there is something else which is not a magic property of the information, but is something that is more fundamentally related with the physical world in which the robot is embedded. But the basic question is, is there any difference between a zombie robot and a true conscious robot, according to Antonio?
Yes, no, thank you, Riccardo. No, I don't believe in this distinction between the zombie robot and the conscious robot. I think the idea of the heart problem of Kalia, it sounds like magic to me. So I think that if a robot behave like a conscious entity, and we are he is conscious, so there is no. I don't think that there is a robot which there is a person which is from the external point of view it is indistinguishable from a person that don't feel anything. So I think that looking from the outside, that we have to use the same parameters that we use with people. So I look at the people from the outside, I look their behavior, I think that the people can be, that a person can be conscious or not, because the person behaves in some way, even in some complicated way, then I can assume that the person is conscious. So I don't think that we can use different parameters, different metrics from a robot instead from other people. So I don't, the same old stories that I don't know if you are conscious or not, but if you behave like a conscious person, you are conscious. I don't believe in this strange thing of hard problem of consciousness or not. So this is a simple, this is my simple question.
Can I just kind of interrupt there to suggest that, so what you're saying, at the beginning, Pietro suggested that your robot Pepper behaves like a sadly retarded, but nevertheless very accommodating person. It never gets angry when he doesn't understand the questions, never feels frustrated. But you would suggest, nevertheless, that insofar as that behavior interacts and resembles human behavior, insofar as it resembles it, then Pepper is conscious as far as you're concerned.
No, I think that there should be some level of, it should be too naive in my opinion. There should be, at one side, there should be some level of complexity. We are at the state of the art, we are not at the level of this level of complexity. And even we need some sort of integration of many capabilities. So there is a human-robot interaction, there is the capability of creating a kind of theory of mind, of self-representation, and so on and so forth. So I see that there is a level of integration of many capabilities that we consider conscious. At the state of the art, we are not at this level. But maybe one day, which is not so far from today, we will reach this level of complexity. And I think that the most important problem from the robotics point of view is the right integration of many capabilities of consciousness. So it is easy to implement one aspect as human robot as linguistic interaction, another aspect which is attention, another aspect which is planning. But the most important problem from the computational point of view is the correct integration of these capabilities. So the robot should pay attention while it talks, while it plans, and so on and so forth. So in my opinion, the core of the problem is the integration of these capabilities.
Okay, Riccardo, question for Pietro. You want?
Let me introduce the reason why I use that politically incorrect word, retarded. The reason is that it lies in suggesting the idea that we can consider, in a sense, the robot consciousness like a retarded consciousness in the same ways we experience in our lives a lot of time to being in a retarded consciousness. For example, after you have a heavy drink, or before you falling asleep, and in many other circumstances in everyday life. And in the same spirit, I suggest to consider that consciousness behavior like a retarded consciousness example. It is matter of being politically incorrect, but not only towards robot, also towards ourselves.
Yeah, I wasn't honestly, Pietro, worried about. I don't think we want to go into correctness on this. But I take the point. One would have to say at this point that the one interesting aspect of human consciousness is how much it changes during the day, after a meal, after a drink, which is probably not going to happen with our robot as yet. And you were right in predicting that Antonio would respond that it was a question of growing complication. So we have an interesting situation. Riccardo, I think it's time for you to ask Pietro a question and to move on to Pietro's.
Yeah, I will just make a quick clarification, and then I will move about my comment on Antonio, and then we'll move to Pietro. But it's related with both, so I think it will not be a waste of time. I think one thing is to build an electric engine, or let's say a steam engine, and another thing is to wonder about the nature of thermodynamics, of the nature of electricity. So of course, I don't deny the possibility that by implementing all such cognitive and computational and integration capabilities in a robot will not lead in the long run probably to implement something very close to a conscious human being or something like that. But nonetheless, this is not enough to provide an explanation as to the physical principles underpinning such a machine. So I think that to understand why such a machine is conscious will require something else, at least from an explanatory perspective. So with Pietro, I would like to ask more or less exactly the same question. So we focus on cognitive functions and various capabilities, and still nothing in such capabilities seems to require the fact of experience. they may just take place and provide a perfectly working cognitive explanation of an agent without requiring the fact of having an experience of reality. So this is not to say that I don't think that consciousness is and cognition are strongly related, but I'm asking him if he really thinks that all we need is in the cognitive science box.
Pietro.
Okay. In a word, Riccardo, I think that having experience, a given experience, feeling something, having an emotion, considering the qualitative part of consciousness, is not a magic. And the same sufficiency thesis we are prompt to accept for access consciousness is enough for the qualitative side of consciousness. It is just a matter of find the right kind of computations. Maybe they are not more complicated than in access consciousness. They are simply obscure for us because it's the qualitative side of consciousness itself obscure for us. We are not ready to show a computational architecture for the qualitative part of consciousness in humans, and therefore we are enabled to do so for machines too. But in the last decades, we have many achievements in qualitative part of consciousness, and in this perspective, I agree with Antonio. We can hope that when the computational architectures for qualia will be sophisticated enough, they can be applied in the robot fields. Furthermore, there is a real novelty in the literature, in the scene, and in fact, this is the deep learning techniques, because deep learning is not aiming at replicate anything in the human brain. They are simple and rude computations, but they are amazing in achievement. Thanks to the deep learning techniques, machines have surpassed human capacity in visual recognition. And visual recognition is a twofold creature, endowed with both an access side and an experience side. And we are faced with a real case of artificial achievements, thanks to another pathway, aimed not to duplicate human-like computation, but with simply engineering goals in mind.
Okay, so Pietro has accepted that there is a qualitative aspect to experience, and he's used the word qualia for it, but insists that there is a computational architecture which could generate this qualitative aspect, and that it is merely a question of arriving at that. Now, that is obviously a position that we know that Riccardo is going to object to when we turn to his position. I wonder, Antonio, if you have a question for Pietro about his presentation.
Yes, so I would like to ask Pietro very simply. Pietro mentioned several times the deep learning approach, the consciousness prior by Joshua Bengio, and so on. So I'm wondering if Pietro thinks that consciousness is something that we can learn, or it's something that we can have for granting since the starting, or it is a kind of skill that we can learn as we learn to recognize people, or we learn to talk and so on. What is your position about the possibility of learning to be conscious?
Okay, thank you, Antonio, for the question, because I have to be honest. I'm living in an enthusiastic phase of my life towards deep learning. And in fact, learning is a good way of thinking of what consciousness is. Because consciousness is not an all or nothing phenomenon. It's nothing. It is a thing that comes in degrees. We have a simple and oldest kind of self-consciousness, that is self-recognition, and these abilities are endowed with a more simple computation than reflective reasoning. For example, in self-recognition, there is not responsibility. It's only a matter of matching two kind of features. On the other side, consider the fact that children are not self-conscious when they are newborns. They learn to be conscious, mainly in the social interactions, because consciousness is by and large a social phenomenon. We are conscious not for be proud of ourselves, but to improve our social cognition skills. For this reason, consciousness is something that people attribute to us more than an intrinsic property of the single individual. These, among many other possibles, are features that allow us to think about consciousness in terms of learning.
If I can say, we remember that Gregory Bateson insisted on the importance of learning how to learn, as he called it, rather than simply learning. But he never, as far as I know, related that to the presence or otherwise of consciousness. As for the young child indeed may be much more unconscious in many ways than the adult, and less aware. But nevertheless, the child reacts emotively and often without any repression, any breaks on emotion, long before they reach other areas of, for example, image matching awareness. But I think the time has come to turn your admiration and your guns on Riccardo. whose position obviously is very different. I presume, for example, that Riccardo would not accept that the so-called qualia, the feeling of the nature of experience, whatever we want to call it, of the color red or something, was a computational structure. Let's start, Antonio. Why don't you? You're very familiar, no doubt, with Riccardo's position. Why don't you seek to find the weak points in his position?
No, I have to say that I'm quite sympathetic with Riccardo. We collaborate, so we are friends, and then so on. Anyway, I think that the Riccardo theory, in some sense, is a kind of mystery for me, because there is this sense of world, of being in the world, that it is difficult to translate from an engineering point of view. It is very difficult to translate in a computational model. Therefore, unless it is very trivial, in some sense it reminds me the very old days of reactive robotics, where there is a robot that tightly, immediately reacts to the external environment. But the possibility of a robot to have a model of the external world, in my opinion, it is an important thing. And in fact, for example, the theory of Riccardo that completely neglects the possibility that a robot have an internal model of itself or the external world, does not allow, for example, to explain the problem of language. So it is very difficult to integrate the problem of language, how do a person has a kind of language, without considering some kind of internal model or symbolic model or 3D model of the external environment. So my objection to the Riccardo theory is that, in some sense, it is difficult. It is, in my opinion, it is really difficult to find some kind of computational model. And on the other side, neglecting the possibility of having some kind of internal world, rule out, for example, the possibility of language, the possibility of planning, and whatever.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, yes, of course, we have some difference in our approach. And such differences are not about the way in which you can implement the cognitive functions or AI, but they're more about the fundamental ontology, about what is consciousness, what is experience. I would like to start from dispelling a misunderstanding that probably it was my fault in the previous two questions. I'm definitely against the notion of qualia or the existence of some magic inside the underpinning of a system. I'm definitely against the notion that consciousness is some kind of spatial phenomenal character concocted inside either the brain or a machine. But for the same reason, I don't think that there's anything like the emergence of computational conscious processes inside a machine. Because basically, I don't think that information and computation are physical stuff. I think they are a way, rather anthropomorphic, to describe what is done by certain devices that we use to mimic mental functions. So I've never seen a bit, so to speak. I've never seen information. And I'm not sure that the information is some kind of natural thing or stuff that may be the basis of anything, but a concept in our descriptions of agents. So you said that I don't believe in internal model. No, I don't believe in them, because for me, a model is just a concept that we use to describe some kind of causal and functional coupling between a system, either biological or artificial, and external environment. So we like to talk about models because they simplify. It's like talking about centers of mass. They are useful concepts, but they're not necessarily real entities. So this is to say that of course, I don't rule. I really like the advances in AI, but I think there's a gap between their description of reality and what we need to understand consciousness, not as a magic trick, not as a magic wall inside the brain, but as a basic feature of the physical world. So I'm not against AI. I'm just asking people to look at what AI or the brain do from a rather different angle. So I'm just asking to make a conceptual shift that is not against AI, but it offers a different view about what roboticists are doing.
Yeah, can I, Riccardo, before getting Pietro to ask the question, can I just ask you what you then would be doing yourself if you were trying to create a robot with consciousness in your vision of consciousness?
Yeah, very quickly. My basic hypothesis is that consciousness is one and the same with the external world, and that bodies are just the proxies of such external worlds. So we need to use the resources that, as Antonio does, as Pietro does, of to implement bodies, and by bodies I also mean the computational and the central processing unit and whatever we put inside the robot, capable of being providing the external world to take place as it does in the case of conscious beings. So I'm asking to see the robot as the proxy of the environment rather than the other way around, as it is customary done in AI and cognitive science that keep having a sort of anthropocentric approach, because they keep seeing the body as the center of cognition, and therefore they need to bring the world inside the body, either in form of representation or models or whatever. I'm asking to see the environment as the true agent and the body only as a proxy, which is thing that roboticists may like, which is something that I think that roboticists may like.
Pietro.
Yeah, in a word, I would like to ask to Riccardo, why are you so worried about physicalism? I would like to say, come on, fellas, no worry. We are only, all people are today materialists in the science. Consider just the way mathematical entities work. They are abstract objects, and nevertheless they are endowed with causal powers. We are not able to see, to touch mathematical entities, but nevertheless they exist. And the same is for computations. Computations are simply abstract entities, and they exist only in an epistemic way. They are not mind-independent creatures. They are not like mountains, for example, or wind. Computations, like mathematical entities, exist only in epistemic, in a subjective way. But nevertheless, they have causal powers. Why are you so worried about physicalism in nowadays?
Yeah, I'm worried about physicalism because I think that all reality is physical, and any advancement in understanding The nature of reality requires to reduce everything to physical entities. And I agree with you that if something has causal powers, it is physical. But I'm not sure that mathematical entities have causal powers. In fact, I think that our behavior when we do mathematics has causal powers, but not mathematical entities as such. I believe that we have causal powers when we talk about the Pythagoras theorem, but I don't think that.
But the same happens with computations. Are not computation, it's themselves that are endowed with causal powers, but the physical part of our body that we describe in as computations.
Yes, but there's no point in which the Pythagoras theorem actually causes the behavior in my body when I do computations. My behavior is always caused by previous physical causes, which are, and none of them is the Pythagoras theorem, as in a Platonic ideal realm. And so, to me, information as an abstract entity has no causal power, and it is just a way to describe what we do. As Wittgenstein said, there aren't abstract concept acting on us. Language is just a form of behavior, and it's a game. And the game is something which is done by bodies. So my insistence on physicalism is the necessity to reduce everything to the smallest number of possible entities. And I think that in the last 100 years, both in information theory and in cognitive science, there have been a proliferation of entities that obscure our understanding of reality, rather than providing us with the simplest and neatest explanation of what's happening. This is not to say that they're not epistemically useful. It's fine to have plenty of concepts, but we don't have to take them all to be true. So, like in the 19th century, people got rid of the notion of ether. I think today we can get rid of many notions that we take them seriously, but they may not be real. And so for me, physicalism is just an appeal to reduce our explanation to the simplest possible ones.
Okay, so Riccardo makes an appeal to Occam at this point. I understand it fairly enough, and I must say that to come back to the question of language, as somebody who spends all my life with language, it does not seem to me to provide a problem supremely different from other forms of behavior. A question of repetition and sounds and learning and so on and so forth. I wonder if this is the point to ask all three of you. We've been here for 45 minutes now. To ask all three of you to make maybe just one final little statement of a minute or so, or just to say something that you feel hasn't perhaps been said, or to sum up your own position swiftly and rapidly, so that our viewers can feel they know where you're all at. So Antonio, let's kick off with you.
Yeah. No, I would like to say that there is no mystery in consciousness. There is nothing magic. There is no qualia. There is nothing. There is a scientific investigation of consciousness. We take into account the ingredients of consciousness, and we can replicate the ingredients of consciousness in a robot or in a computational entity, and we can integrate these computational entities. And this is useful not only for for creating a new generation of robots or whatever. But even it allows us to better understand what is consciousness. So a role of machine consciousness, of the study of robot consciousness, is to better understand the human consciousness, of course. But because we have more, we better understand consciousness because we are able to build it in some sense. So knowing by doing. So doing robot consciousness allows us to understand consciousness by building a new consciousness. This is my statement in some sense.
Okay.
Thank
Pietro.
My account is characterized by a maybe attitude. In a word, the idea is the following. We need to have computations sophisticated enough to get machine consciousness. But to have this kind of computations, we have to put the right concept of what consciousness is in the very beginning of our research pathway. If we have a wrong way from the beginning, we are not supposed to expect that the right computations will arise as a natural phenomenon. And for this reason, I stay in the middle between the skepticism of Riccardo and the enthusiastic attitude typical of the Antonio and the roboticists.
Okay, Riccardo.
Okay, vote for me if you think that the current scientific picture and AI picture of cognition and the mind is not enough. This is not to say that there's anything wrong in Antonio's and Pietro's approach, but vote for me if you think that we need to revise our fundamental notions of reality in order to put together the pieces of the jigsaw of the problem of consciousness in a radically new way. And by using such a new perspective to start doing AI and not just with deeper understanding of their connection with the physical world.
Okay. Well, thanks to all of you, Antonio Chella, Riccardo Manzotti, Pietro Perconti. I think that's it for our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Finally, you can vote. This is the link to the survey where you can vote. Your vote is anonymous, and the results for the vote will be freely available. Thank you for your attention.